Shalom, everyone. I should actually say Shabbat Shalom, which means Sabbath peace, because that is the greeting that we offer on the Sabbath. And this particular podcast is the second one dealing with Shabbat. Shabbat, the Sabbath, is very, very important, and it is directly related to what we call the secret Jews of the Southwest. Because the fact of the case is, with the exception of the high holidays of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the Sabbath is a major holiday of the Jewish faith. Remembering that the Sabbath was actually created before the Jewish people, when God rested on the seventh day and felt that human beings should have a sacred day of rest. It was difficult, however, in Spain and Portugal during the time of the Spanish Inquisition to follow all of the traditions, laws, and practices that were part of the Sabbath observance. As important as it would had to be done secretly. And some of the things that I will be talking about today will relate to what we do today and what was done at that time. But one of the things that we have to understand is that when Christianity established a change, moving the Sabbath to Sunday, it became a little bit conflicted for the Jewish people. So I know crypto Jews today who go to church on Sunday, and then on the Sabbath, they will observe different Sabbath traditions secretly. And for us, the Sabbath begins on Friday evening and concludes on Saturday night. And that's why one of the common hints that a person had crypto-Jewish ancestry was the fact that that person would light candles on Friday night, and sometimes even to this day, 500 years later, even though they were practicing Christianity, and they didn't necessarily know that this tradition of lighting candles was a Jewish tradition done on Friday night. Now, speaking of that, one of the traditions of the Jewish people is to light candles on holidays, but especially on the Sabbath. And the way we welcome the Sabbath on Friday night is through two separate candles. One of them is for one version of the Ten Commandments, which says, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekadsho, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And the other version in Deuteronomy, that was in Exodus, in Deuteronomy says, Shamor et HaShabbat, to observe the Sabbath. In other words, one could remember the Sabbath, but not observe it. You could remember, oh, this is the Sabbath, but not light candles. Another person, and this was very true of the crypto Jews, would shamor. They would observe the lighting of the candles, but they did not know why. So this is one of the reasons that it's very, very important. Now, a practice that was done by the idolaters that in ancient times was to sacrifice their children to their gods. On the Sabbath, we think of that because some of this we understand was done even while people were alive. Judaism came along and said, no, we understand the importance of sacrificing something to God so that God would realize that we are grateful to God for our blessings in life. When there was a holy temple, we would, on the Sabbath and on other days, we would sacrifice animals to God to thank God for giving us those animals. Now, I don't know if the temple were rebuilt today, whether that particular practice would continue. You know, different things in life change as society changes. What we might have accepted years ago, we might not accept today. And that would be because to actually sacrifice an animal might seem something that was extremely cruel. So I can't really tell you what would happen if we rebuild the temple. But the point I do want to make has to do with the prohibition of work on the Sabbath. And to tell you, again, some of the things that crypto Jews do and some of the things that Jews do today as history progresses to the modern era. For example, there is a Hebrew word called malachah, and there is another Hebrew word called avodah. They both mean work, and there were specific works, types of work, that the Talmud and the Shulchan Aruch, the book of Jewish law, would forbid. One of them having to do with fire. Another would have to do with carrying money. This is all on the Sabbath. Another one would have to be any form of actual physical work whatsoever. But as I said, in ancient times, when animal sacrifices replaced the sacrifice of children that idolaters did, there were specific sacrifices done on the Sabbath. We know that for a fact, and that involved fire. So the prohibition about fire is actually found in the book of Exodus, chapter 31, in which it says that you shall not kindle a fire in your habitation. That means in your home. So that is why certain traditional Jews will not even use electricity. Let me talk about that for a moment, and then I'll come back to what this has to do with crypto Jews. In the Jewish tradition, there are two large ethnic divisions. One is the Sephardic community, which comes from Spain and Spanish-speaking countries, and the other is the Ashkenazic or Eastern European, which comes from Eastern European countries, obviously, like Russia, Germany, Hungary, etc. Now, the Sephardic Jews, their quote-unquote special language was Ladino, and the Ashkenazic Jews, their quote-unquote special language was Yiddish. But there were also traditions that were different practices depending on your ethnicity. For example, Sephardic Jews would never name a person, newborn baby, after a dead relative, only after a living relative. Ashkenazic Jews, just the opposite. They would not name after a living relative, but after a deceased relative, for various reasons. Now, besides those two ethnic groups, over the years, there was a division in terms of interpretation of law. For example, in biblical days, you had the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees had a more liberal interpretation. The Sadducees were very, very literal. They took the law, and you could not make a bend one way or the other. And now today, you fast forward to the modern era, you have Orthodoxy, which is the most traditional. You have Reform, which is the most liberal. You have Conservative, which is in between. You have Reconstructionist, which is a different branch, came out of conservative but is now more liberal. You even had a branch of Judaism that was similar to ethical culture, in which that branch of Judaism didn't actually believe in God and yet believed in practices. All of this has a way of our understanding how we approach Judaism and interpretation today. So, for example, let me go back to the fire. It says, you may not light a fire in your habitation. When you come to synagogue on the Sabbath, and synagogues are not necessarily very close to the person's habitation, the question is it permissible to take a car to the synagogue? Now, Orthodoxy would basically say no. Why? And it's a very technical, because there's a fire. When you start a car, there's a spark plug. I don't know about the electric cars today, but the older cars, there's a spark plug. A little fire just for a second. The Reform say it's totally irrelevant. That law is not relevant for us today. And the Conservatives say you can drive, if it's the only way you can get to synagogue, you can drive back and forth to the synagogue. Well, let me explain how the Conservative came to that rule, how I come to that rule. When I said work, to light a fire in ancient times was work. You didn't have the means that you have. If you saw the movie with Tom Hanks, in which he's on an island, it took him all of the time. He couldn't light that fire because he was rubbing these sticks together. That was work. And the Orthodox who say that electricity you can't turn on, they create a legal fiction. What they do is they have a timer, and the timer turns on the lights for them. I don't know, and I can't speak for God. It says in the Talmud, if I knew God, I would be God. But the fact of the case is that I don't know. Anyone can do how they feel, what they're most comfortable with. But I think it's unfair to judge people who take one interpretation over the other. And that is what I go back with the B'nai Anusim. There are some people who judge the B'nai Anusim because they have been practicing Christianity for hundreds of years, that they're not really sincere in their return, and they may not accept them. There's a debate whether they have to go through a full conversion or whether they have to go through another practice of returning to Judaism. To tell you the truth, I have brought back over about 230 or 240 families now, crypto Jews have returned to Judaism. I have them go through the same tradition that would be accepted as a regular conversion of someone who never had any Jewish roots. But I do that because today in Israel, they will only recognize to a certain extent a conversion as opposed to return. Things are changing and it's moving forward, and the Bnei Anusim are more recognized in Israel today. Many people who have done their return with me have actually made Aliyah and actually live in Israel today. So getting back to the Holy Temple, it says in your habitation, we know when I said that animal sacrifice replaced sacrificing human beings, when the Holy Temple was destroyed, especially the second time by the Romans at the time of Herod, the first temple was destroyed in 586 BCE by the Babylonians. But we know that when people came back to Israel after being expelled to Babylonia for a long time, that there were synagogues already in Israel. But the Holy Temple was rebuilt, so animal sacrifices were returned. Once that second temple was rebuilt, synagogue services replaced sacrifices, even by their name. For example, on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, which is what we're talking about, and on certain festivals, an additional service called Musaf was added to the service. It's not done on weekdays, only on the Sabbath and festivals. Why? Because there was a Musaf. There was an additional sacrifice in ancient times of the animal. Mincha, the afternoon service every single day, including the Sabbath. The word mincha doesn't mean afternoon service. It means sacrifice. So once again, these observances of the Musaf and the mincha replace animal sacrifices with prayer service today. I would like to just take a short break at this time to talk about the Holy Temple. The Holy Temple was destroyed, as I said, the second one in the year 70. We have a prayer in which we pray that one day that temple will be rebuilt. And I'd just like to share a cantorial piece that has to do with that event. And it says, may God one day, and may we live to see the rebuilding of the Holy Temple, so that there will be one day a third temple in Jerusalem. And it goes like this. Yehi ratzon milfanecha Adonai Eloheinu ve'Elohei avoteinu sheyibane beit hamikdash b'mehera v'yameinu v'tein chelikeinu b'toratecha 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 v'tein Helikeinu b'toratecha. Another addition to Shabbat services was on Friday evening a group of psalms which was called the Kabbalat Shabbat. The Kabbalistic Jews that lived in a city which is still in Israel, in the northern part of Israel. In Hebrew it's called Sfat. It is called Safed in English, and it is a city where the Kabbalists, the people that believed in Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, many of them were Sephardic Jews. Many of them were Jewish ancestors of the Bnei Anusim. Added 5 Psalms, 95 through 100. Each one of them was a different way of approaching the Sabbath. They would dress in white, and they would run to the city and with their hands symbolically welcome the Sabbath into the community. The first one of these Psalms, Psalm 95, makes it a theme of joy. It starts like this. Lechu neranen al Adonai, Naria, Litzur Yishenu. Lechu neranina, lechu neranina, lechu neranin al Hashem. Lechu neranina, lechu neranina, lechu neranina al Hashem. Naria, naria, litzur yishenu, nikad mafana b'todah. Naria, naria, litzur yishenu, bizmirot naria lo. The English, O come, let us sing unto the Lord. Let us joyfully acclaim the rock of our salvation. It's all about singing. It's all about joy. The next psalm was in order. Psalm 96 starts this way. Shiru ladonai shir chadash, shiru ladonai kol haaretz, shiru ladonai baruchu shemoho, basru miyom liyom yeshuato. O sing unto the Lord a new song. Sing unto the Lord, all the earth. Sing unto the Lord, bless God's name. Proclaim God's salvation from day to day. They were again singing to God and praising God. It immediately goes to Psalm 97. Adonai malach tagel haaretz yismechuim rahabim. The Lord reigns, may the earth rejoice. Let the multitude of islands rejoice. In other words, let actually the land that God had created rejoice. Joy comes from our depths. It comes from our beginning. It comes from the earth, and it goes up to heaven. We now go to the next one in order, Psalm 98. Mihizmor shiru ladonai shir chadash, ki niflot asa. O sing unto the Lord a new song, for God has done marvelous things. All of these, they're not new psalms, but they were added to the service. They were part of the Bible. They became part of the service in the Middle Ages and until this very day. Psalm 99. Adonai malach yirgezu amim yoshev kiruvim tanu ta'aretz. The Lord reigns while the people stand in awe. God is enthroned upon his judgment seat while the earth trembles. And the last verse, exalt the Lord our God and worship at his holy mountain, for the Lord our God is holiness. We move from the joy to a more serious recognition, even a symbolic throne of God, giving an anthropomorphic quality to God. In other words, that God has human, God actually sits. That seat is a seat of glory for all of us. And the other song that I just wanted to talk about is called Lecha Dodi. During the Lecha Dodi, we equate the Sabbath to a bride and to a queen. And when we chant the last verse, it's traditional to rise, face the entrance of the synagogue, and welcome the Sabbath with our hands, actually welcome the Sabbath into our community. This particular psalm was written by a man by the name of Solomon Alkabetz. He was a rabbi, lived in the 16th century, again, in the city of Safed, or Tzafat, and he was a Kabbalistic Sephardic rabbi. And it's interesting that the verses, those of you that will know Hebrew, each of the first verses starts with a letter of his name. Shin, Lamed, Mem, He is Shlomo, and that represents his name, the author of this book. And the very last verse is the one in which we welcome the Sabbath. I'd just like to chant that one for you. Boi v'shalom ateret bala, gam b'simcha u'v'tzahala, toch emunei am sigula, boi chala, lecha dodi likrat kala, pnei Shabbat nehekabela, lecha dodi likrat kala, pnei Shabbat nehekabela. At that point, someone suffered the loss of a loved one in the community. We offer a prayer to that person, and we say to them, Hamakom yinachem etchem b'tok sha'ar avelei Tzion v'Yerushalayim. May the Lord comfort and sustain you among the other mourners for Zion and Jerusalem. I always say that verse anyway, whether or not there is someone who specifically lost a loved one, because as part of the B'nai Anusim Synagogue and Center, I know that history of the B'nai Anusim was filled with the loss of thousands, actually hundreds of thousands of people who died because they were practicing Judaism, and the church and Ferdinand and Isabella wanted to prevent them from doing that. At this point in the service, we continue with another two psalms. One is a specific psalm for the Sabbath day, And then there is a shorter one which talks about God reigning and is robed in majesty. And then we have a period of time of which we say the mourner's Kaddish for those people who have suffered the loss of a loved one. But before we continue the service, we take a moment out and we have what is called a Devar Torah, a word about the Torah. It is our belief that the Sabbath is not only a day to pray, it's not only a day of joy, it's not only a day of people coming together, but it's also a day of study. There is this verse in the Talmud which says, Talmud Torah keneged kulam, which means that the study of Torah gives us the ability to deal with anything that happens in this world. And so I'd like to offer a brief Devar Torah for this Sabbath podcast. And once again, I have to reflect on the week that's going on even right now as I articulate these words, because we still go back to October 7th. It's now been 7 weeks, and now we are beginning to see a little bit of light because we see now the release of hostages. And the release of hostages, in Judaism, there's a prayer that we say, Blessed are you, O Lord our God, Matir Asurim, we say it every day, who frees the captives. We did not know that we would have to be saying it more specifically to these more than 230 hostages. And as we see them come out, the mood of the world right now is so mixed about these hostages that it's almost difficult to understand what this world is like today. Because on the one hand, people are saying, oh, you see, they are compassionate people. They're letting these hostages free. We should be a little bit more compassionate toward them. And yet, there was this 4-year-old child, American child, came out, and Hamas actually murdered her parents in front of her. And now she's back, and now we speak to some of her relatives. Yes, they freed her today. They freed her only because Israel had an agreement that they would free 3 times as many of their captives, and those people, a number of those people were arrested that had nothing to do with October 7th. It was crimes that they had committed, including killing Jewish people over the years, and they were been in prison. And so there was an exchange of those prisoners for these hostages. And as I said, this 4-year-old girl, who knows how her life will ever be again. Now she's going to be raised by an aunt and uncle. Grandparents, thank God, are alive. One of the people that we said a special prayer for was this woman that came out yesterday who was 84 years old with a heart condition. Her son came to the Red Cross and asked them to please bring her medication. They said they could not. So she had been without her medication. She immediately is in critical condition. Her name is Alma Abraham. She's in the hospital right now. And of course, we pray that she will completely recover. But what I'm trying to say is that the main theme of the Sabbath has always been the creation of humanity. The Sabbath was created after God created the first human beings. And the purpose of the creation of the first human beings was to have humanity live. God didn't have to do that. What did God create human beings? It was for us. And I once reviewed with you what happened at the time of Noah. The whole world was evil until 10 generations after Noah. We have the creation of the first, not the creation of, I said we have the first Jew, Abraham, who comes to the belief in one God. The Sabbath for us teaches us the sanctity of human life. We as a Jewish people, and many of those who are here who are B'nai Anusim, and let me just say one more word before we conclude this podcast. The B'nai Anusim are incredible people, and I'll tell you why. Because they returned to a faith that they were tortured for simply being born Jews. They return to that faith now, 500 years later, and they now have the opportunity as being fully accepted as Jews in our crypto-Jewish community, in our Anusim Synagogue and Center. They are now accepted, participate fully with all of us. And what's really important about that is that they didn't allow the torture, the execution, and the expulsion of their ancestors to affect them. We pray that as these hostages return, we hope all of them will return. We also hope that one day, as Golda Meir said to Anwar Sadat, that one day the people that hate us will stop hating us and that they will love our children. Right now, they don't love our children. How can you not love children? The Sabbath is a day of sanctity. It's a day of life. And we pray that the whole world will learn the lesson of Shabbat. And we thank the B'nai Anusim for their return and making Shabbat so very, very special in our synagogue and center. I wish everyone a Shabbat Shalom. I thank you for listening. I hope you can come to services at our Anusim Center and Synagogue, and you will continue to support this podcast and the Jewish community throughout the world. Shabbat Shalom.